Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Cleveland and to the first John Glenn Memorial Symposium. The theme this year is Powering Innovation from the Sky to the Stars. I'm really thrilled to be here today, and there's going to be a lot of people to thank for putting this together. It takes a village to get one of these conferences organized, and the speakers and all of that. But I wanted to start off by recognizing three very special people that seeded the idea for this conference almost 2 years ago. So Frank Slager, who is a former president of the American Astronautical Society, Dr. Janet Kavandi, the Center Director for Glenn Research Center, and Lori Manthe, the Chief of Staff for Glenn. These three really had put their heads together, had the vision, and provided the leadership to take us down this path to where we are today. So I really want to recognize those beginnings, and I think we've got a terrific conference lined up. I'm Carol Lane, president of the American, Astronautical Society. For those of you that don't know AAS, we were founded in 1954 as an organization to promote space and the role space plays in the economy, national security, international relations, and technology leadership and innovation, and of course, inspiration and education. And we do this at the core of what AAS is by providing conferences like this where we bring people together to both educate and network and hopefully broaden your horizons on the topics of the conferences. We've done this for a while. In fact, this year we held the 57th Goddard Memorial Symposium in Greenbelt, Maryland, partnered with the Goddard Space Flight Center. In 2 weeks, we will be working with CASIS and NASA, hosting the International Space Station Research and Development Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. It's the 9th ISS conference. And then in September, we have the 12th Von Braun Conference in Huntsville, Alabama, partnered with the Marshall Space Flight Center. So take note of this historic day. You guys are participants in the first Glenn Conference, and we hope that it will be on our list of annual conferences for many years to come. Please give us your feedback and let us know how we can improve it, and we really welcome your input. Another first for this conference is a presentation of the Molly McCauley Award. Molly McCauley was a space economist who worked for Resources for the Future, and she was also on the board of AAS. And her untimely passing was a loss for the space world, but very personally it was for AAS. We really felt that loss and wanted to honor her in a way that represented both who she was and her contribution to the space community. So after the first break, I would really encourage you all to come back. We have a very special presentation that we'd like to make in presenting the first annual Molly McCauley Award. We kicked off this conference last night, for those of you that were able to make it, at the Great Lakes Science Center, which was just a terrific venue, and it was generously sponsored by Aerojet Rocketdyne, so we really appreciate that. It was an excellent event and a great venue. Today, the breakfast and break sponsors for the day is Pratt & Whitney, so thank you for that. And I'd just like to take the moment to recognize all of our sponsors: Aerojet Rocketdyne, the Aerospace Corporation, BWX Technologies, Dynetics, GE Aviation, Maxar, Moog, Pratt & Whitney, Zinn Technologies, and our media sponsor, Space News. We really appreciate you stepping up, and without your support, we really couldn't make this happen. So we're grateful to have you partners in this. And now I'd also like to recognize and thank the Planning Committee. Our chair is Janet Kavandi, and then the other members are Gail Allen, Vince Bilardo, Ron Burke, Ann Bouchard, Michael Cinconi, I hope I got that right, Alan DeLuna, Josh Free, Becky Griffin, Carlos Grodzinski, Lori Manthe, Kathy Nadeau, Marla Perez Davis, Ashley Reiser, Patrick Rowan, Brett Silcox, Frank Slager, and our executive director, Jim Way. We've had a great partnership with Glenn. We really appreciate all the resources they've brought to this and look forward to a great couple of days. So a couple things on logistics, I think, are coming up. Do we have the Wi-Fi information? So you have that if you have any issues connecting. The bathrooms are out the atrium doors to the left. And if you are doing social media, we'd appreciate and encourage our hashtag, which is hashtag Glenn Symposium 2019. So before I bring up our first speaker, we have a special introduction video, and if we could start that.
I'm Sherrod Brown. It's a privilege to serve as Ohio's United States Senator. Thanks to Jim Way and everyone with the American Astronautical Society for all you do to continue our country's leadership in space innovation. To those of you not fortunate enough to be from Cleveland, welcome to my hometown. As you know, Ohio's always reached for the heavens, the Wright brothers, to Geraldine Mock, to the man you're honoring with this symposium, my longtime friend, John Glenn. I had the privilege of getting to know John and Annie many years ago. I'm proud that today my office occupies the same Senate office in Washington where John Glenn served. John was a Roosevelt Democrat. He knew from personal experience, as he wrote in his memoir, that, as he said, government can change people's lives for the better. John knew that no one reaches the stars on its own. It's why we need investment in research and innovation that supports the work that you do. We're home in our state to great aerospace institutions like NASA Glenn and the Air Force Research Lab at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. They're research partners at our great universities and in the private sector. I've worked to make sure these institutions get the federal funding they need. Last year, we secured the largest military construction ever made in Ohio for NASIC. We're willing to make sure this year's National Defense Authorization Act includes investment in the important research you do. We need to prepare the next generation to go into the industries of the future. For 7 years, my office has hosted summer manufacturing camps across Ohio for 4th to 8th graders so students can see where their STEM education can take them in the real world. They go out to business, they're there for a day camp for the whole week. They go to business, a different business every day. They learn to make things with their hands and their brains and to see so much. As you plan for the future at today's conference, think about opportunities like that to get involved in your communities. Become a mentor. Help kids envision themselves as an engineer or a scientist or an astronaut or a welder. It's up to all of us to follow John Glenn's example. Make sure our country continues to lead the world toward new frontiers for generations to come. Thank you so much for coming to Cleveland.
So what a great tribute to both John Glenn and to have a member of Congress that is so supportive and knowledgeable about what you do in the state and the value that it contributes to the state. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Janet Kavandi as the director of Glenn Research Center here in Cleveland. Prior to accepting this position, she served as Glenn's deputy director, and before that, director of flight crew operations at the Johnson Space Center. She also served as the deputy director of the Health and Human Performance Directorate, where she was responsible for the NASA flight surgeons and human research investigations on the International Space Station. She was selected as an astronaut in December 1994 as the 15th class of U.S. astronauts, and is a veteran of 3 space shuttle flights, serving as a mission specialist on STS-91 in 1998, STS-99 in 2000, and on STS-104 in 2001. She has logged more than 33 days in space, traveling more than 13.1 million miles and 535 Earth orbits. So with that, please welcome Dr. Kavandi.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Cleveland. For those of you who are out of state, we welcome you to Cleveland today. It's kind of a rainy day, but I think it will clear up and then be a really nice day tomorrow. And thanks for those who could come yesterday, and maybe some of those who took some of the tours yesterday. We are very happy to start this inaugural John Glenn Memorial Symposium. All of us at NASA Glenn Research Center are very excited to have you here in Cleveland, and we look forward to the discussions that will take place and to the progress that will be made from this conference. So why Cleveland? Why are we here in Ohio? Well, we really can attribute it all back to Orville and Wilbur Wright, the first to flight. While the first flight actually took place in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the brothers had laid the groundwork for their heavier-than-air contraption in the back room of a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. Little did they realize that their winged bicycle experiment laid the groundwork for Ohio's aerospace legacy way back in 1901. However, World War II changed our collective perception of human flight, and that shift set Ohio on a different aerospace path. By the end of that war, Cleveland had become a hub for design and production of aircraft materials and parts. Around that same time, Glenn L. Martin, with the help of local financiers, founded the city's first aircraft factory. Over the years, Martin's small company would move to Baltimore and evolve into a slightly larger aerospace company now known as Lockheed Martin. But his Cleveland design team would spawn the careers of several famous people, including Donald Douglas, the founder of the Douglas Aircraft Company, whose aircraft would be the first to circumnavigate the world. Lawrence Bell, the designer of the Bell X-1, the first supersonic plane. James McDonald, who would go on to form the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation and build the Mercury and Gemini capsules that first carried Americans into space. And James Dutch Kindleberger, creator of North American Aviation, that would go on to build the Apollo Command and Service Module, which would carry the first humans to the moon. In 1940, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, selected Cleveland over 62 other cities as the site for its aircraft engine research laboratory. The same center which now has become, well, through evolution, the Lewis Research Center and now the John Glenn Research Center. Over the next decade, Lewis would become home to some of the nation's first test facilities dedicated to designing, developing, and perfecting aircraft engines, including the premier facility for fundamental engine research that helped improve America's first jet engines, as well as the first large-scale icing research tunnel, which is still in operation today. A few years later, at the beginning of the space age, the center became part of the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and its aircraft engine research was reduced in favor of rocket engine research, particularly focused on liquid hydrogen propulsion and upper stage launch vehicles. These efforts contributed to the development of the Centaur and helped pave the way for the first human flight to the moon. In addition to chemical propulsion research, the center was also critical in the development of the spacecraft powered by electric propulsion. The Space Electric Rocket Test, or SERT missions, were central to establishing Lewis as a leader in advanced in-space electric propulsion. In addition to the impressive development and test capabilities in Ohio, two impressive boys were born in Ohio in the early 20th century, one in Cambridge and the other in Wapakoneta. These two boys, one named John Glenn and the other named Neil Armstrong, became national heroes, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of the nation and the world as America caught up to and then surpassed the Soviet Union in the space race. John Glenn, the first man to complete a supersonic cross-country flight, would become a household name as the first American to orbit the Earth in a Mercury spacecraft. And his string of achievements didn't end there. In 1998, while still serving as one of Ohio's senators, John Glenn flew on space shuttle mission STS-95, making him the oldest person to ever fly in space, a record still held today, while also becoming the only person to fly in both the Mercury and space shuttle program. And perhaps the most famous of first, Neil Armstrong became the first human to step foot on another world on July 20th, 1969, very nearly 50 years ago this coming week. Neil started his NASA career in 1955 as a research pilot here in Cleveland, and from those humble beginnings, he would ascend to infamy. He was not only the first man to walk on the moon, but also the first to conduct an in-orbit spacecraft rendezvous and docking during Gemini 8. Today, a half century since that first lunar landing, and more than a century after the Wright brothers first flew, Ohio is still shaping the future of space exploration and aviation. NASA is preparing for Artemis 1, the first flight of the Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System. We are also developing the first outpost in lunar orbit, and all of this will lead to the first woman and next man to walk on the moon in 2024. Later this year, NASA Glenn will test the Artemis 1 spacecraft at Plumbrook Station in Sandusky, Ohio, many of whom you went and saw that yesterday. Plumbrook is the only place in the world where a spacecraft the size of Orion can be tested in multiple simulated space environments under one roof. This capability allows us to reduce risk and accelerate our plans, and we're extremely proud to be in the critical path for Artemis 1. Our center's long legacy of advancing in-space propulsion systems is also the reason we're managing the design, development, and in-flight test of the first component of NASA's lunar platform, Gateway. This high-power, 50-kilowatt class solar electric propulsion spacecraft, the power and propulsion element, will allow the Gateway to become a mobile command and service module in lunar orbit, providing our explorers access to the entire lunar surface. By 2028, we will have helped create a sustainable presence on the lunar surface, taking what we learned there to send astronauts on to Mars. And we're still pushing the edge of the envelope in aviation as NASA Glenn looks to shift the paradigm of commercial aviation through our fundamental work on hybrid electric propulsion in aircraft power systems, by wind tunnel testing NASA's first X-plane aimed at quieting the sonic boom, and through the development and integration of advanced materials and components for aircraft. We're on the verge of creating a new set of firsts which will define our legacy and our future. Well, but who will be our next visionaries and pioneers? Many of them are sitting in the room with us here today. And others are sitting in classrooms around our universities today, dreaming of their chance to perhaps fly a commercial electric aircraft across country, or maybe just be one of those first people on Mars. So once again, welcome to the first inaugural Glenn Memorial Symposium. I hope you enjoy your time here this week. I hope you learn many new things, and I hope you leave inspired. And now it is my pleasure to introduce NASA's Deputy Administrator, Mr. Jim Morhard. Jim was nominated by President Trump and sworn in as NASA's 14th Deputy Administrator on October 17th, 2018. Prior to his tenure with NASA, Jim was the U.S. Senate Deputy Sergeant at Arms. He began his career as an analyst for the Secretary of the Navy, where he reviewed procurement and research development programs. Beginning in 1991, Jim served on the Senate Appropriations Committee, working on the Defense and Military Construction and the Commerce, Justice, and State subcommittees. In 2003, he became Chief of Staff of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee, where he worked with the House and Senate leaders, the Office of Management and Budget, and the White House to pass the 2004 and 2005 omnibus appropriations bills. Jim earned his bachelor's degree in accounting from St. Francis University, an MBA from George Washington University, and his Juris Doctor from Georgetown University. Please help me welcome NASA's Deputy Administrator, Mr. Jim Morhard.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. First want to thank Janet for setting this up and making this happen, as well as Carol Lane and Jim Way, who helped me make sure I try to hit all the notes for you today. You know, this is the first symposium that Glenn Research Center has had. It's also the first symposium any research center has had. And we're going to focus on a lot of the great things that Glenn Research Center is doing. And when I say that, I'm talking about alloy development, electric propulsion in space, surface and power development for Moon and Mars, autonomous communications, and in the area of aeronautics, hypersonics, hybrid electric aircraft, and our low-boom flight demonstrator. Janet actually met with the administrator privately 2 days ago, I think. She was the only center director. They were all in town in Washington. She was the only one who met privately with the administrator because he has such a great interest in aeronautics, having been a naval aviator. Before I go on, though, I want to share you a personal story. I know you're going to have David Glenn here today. I wish I was able to meet him and hear what he's going to say. I was 6 years old when John Glenn orbited the Earth. And I found myself a few months later in Arlington, Virginia, where I lived, getting pushed out of my parents' Ford white station wagon. It was one of the ones where the back window was on hinges. It was, we're talking early 60s. And I was walking with my brother Jay. He was 9. We walked up to this small brick house. It was a Rambler off of Williamsburg Boulevard, as I recall. Knocked on the door. Man opened the door, and it was John Glenn. And he let us in. I petted the cat. He gave me a glass of water, got his autograph. That was the first time I met John Glenn. And that certainly had an effect on my life. Later, I ended up, as Janet mentioned, I was on the Appropriations Committee, and I was in charge of a $7 billion program for military construction. And John Glenn had that subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee. So we ended up working together on these programs. And it was really interesting because he had an indelible memory. And it was challenging for his staff because they would give him information, and he really had a hard time changing the information once it was in his head. And you can see how that worked for the space program. But I had the opportunity to share with him the first time we met, and he was the same gentleman, the same kind man that he was when he was an astronaut. He was a wonderful, wonderful human being. I think, if anything, that's what I remember about John Glenn. I stand here and I see you here today in Ohio. I see the talents and disciplines that represent America's capabilities. You're the leaders who are going to inspire the next generation. Because like John Glenn's orbits, if we're not flying, we're not going to be finding new technologies or new science. And if we're not flying, we're not going to be exploring. And we're not going to be leading. This is a transformational era. We're in the middle of it. I've been saying in all the speeches, I've been doing this job 8 months. In all my speeches, I've been saying it's one campaign, 3 domains. Janet gets me up here, and I realize it's 4 domains because I've left out aeronautics, which is just as important. And when I say that, let's face it, we're trying to catch up in hypersonics. It's critical. Low boom flight demonstrator. Right now we fly about 0.6 Mach. If this works out, we'll be flying 2 times as fast. For some of you coming from places like California, that's going to make a big difference, as well as international travel. Hybrid electric aircraft. Again, let's face it, the Chinese with their labor rates are coming. They're coming, they're trying to develop something like a 737. We can beat them with technology. That's why we're working on it. I remember early in my career, I was sent over to China to try to learn what they were doing. And I met with one of their admirals at one of their shipbuilding sites. And they didn't have too many of them at the time. And I asked him what his labor rate was, and he said, $30. And I said, I thought, well, it's not going to be a day. I said, a week? He goes, no, a month. Now, that was many years ago, but that's part of what the challenge is for us. But to me, that's the first domain. The second domain, low Earth orbit and our other orbits. We're seeing a proliferation of satellites right now, and it's just starting. And we're going to need to manage those satellites. We're going to have challenges like space debris. We've already had a couple of ASAT tests that we really didn't care for. Each time that happens, it makes it more and more difficult to operate in low Earth orbit. I look at it much like we used to talk about the sea lanes of commerce. We're really starting to look at the space lanes of commerce. When you talk, people, I know people laugh about Space Force, but it's really protecting those space lanes of commerce. That's what we're talking about here. Jim Bridenstine, who's the administrator, has said, we want to become one of many customers in space. We're no longer wanting to own and operate much of the hardware that we used to in space. Instead, we want to buy services from commercial partners. That's where I see us going in the second domain. The third domain is the moon. And the moon is really, let me be clear, it's a springboard to get to Mars and beyond. We choose to land the first woman on the moon by 2024. We've named the program Artemis. It was the twin sister of Apollo in Greek mythology. You've heard she's the goddess of the moon. Few people mention that Homer called her the torchbringer, and she's really lighting the way to Mars. You think about it, half our population in the United States was not alive for the first landing of the moon. I was a child of Apollo. My hope is my children and my grandchildren will be children of Artemis. This month we honor Apollo for all the amazing deeds they did. Afterwards, we won't be looking in the rearview mirror. As a parent, for many of you, you know your children don't advance unless they leave the security and safety of home. The efforts we're making now are the stepping stones to leave the home we call Earth, to explore Mars and beyond. Really is our opportunity to bring the world together for the biggest accomplishment humankind will ever undertake. But what is that? We're really talking about a logistics tale. I can remember I was on the Defense Appropriations Committee, and we were getting briefed after the first Iraq War, and Norman Schwarzkopf came in and he said, I wasn't worried about our warfighters. I was worried about the logistics. I had to get the logistics to them to accomplish our tasks. I'm not worried about us attaining the science and the technology to do what we need to do. What I'm worried about is getting the logistics to where it needs to go. And I'll talk about that today. We're really starting with precursor missions. When you think about Apollo, there were 23 missions before Apollo 11, really setting the stage. We have a program called the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program, and it's really high-value, low-risk robotics. We'll be sending things to the moon way before we land on it again. At the same time, right now, we're working on funding a human landing system, human habitat capabilities, and again, I keep mentioning logistics. The strategy is also coming together for surface suits that we'll use on the moon. Again, each one of these are being proven out to see whether we can use them on Mars. We're also working on a rover called Viper. We're really focused on a reusable architecture in each case. I know you hear about SpaceX, and it's amazing what they're doing with reusable launchers. SLS is not reusable, but everything else that we've got is set up to be reusable. We're going in that direction. Let me talk about SLS a little bit, Space Launch System. We're talking about the largest rocket ever made. It's going to provide the largest mass and volume that we need, again, for logistics. I was just down in Michoud 2 weeks ago, where they're assembling 4 of the 5 pieces of the core stage. The 4 RS-25 engines were delivered that week. They're going to start integrating them into the rocket. We're starting to stack Orion and the service module together. And last week, I want to say Tuesday, we had the ascent abort flight test that was a success. The day I got confirmed on the Senate floor, one of the Soyuz rockets was going up with one of our American astronauts in it, and it had to abort. And I thought, boy, that's quite a start for my career at NASA. But it was a success, thank goodness, and it had never been tested fully. So it really is amazing the technology it takes just in that system alone. So you think about the whole system. SLS, Orion is the capsule. It gets to the lunar orbit. Where does it go? It goes to what we call Gateway. There's been a lot of talk about Gateway. People argue, oh, it's another space station. I liken, if the space station is a Marriott, Gateway's a pup tent. When I say that, it's really a very small habitat module to live in, and a second part of it is a power, propulsion, and communications vehicle. And that recently was awarded to Maxar Technologies. Part of that will be a 50 kilowatt solar electric propulsion piece of it. That's the solar electric propulsion that we're developing there is 3 times more than anything we've ever done in solar electric. We look at Gateway as a command module, and it'll be a command module, one, to deploy to the moon, but also to deploy to Mars. It also will be a communications relay to robotics and to humans on the moon. It's maneuverable, and the most important part is we can get to the moon right now, but we can't get out of low Earth orbit without Gateway. That's the most important part of Gateway. The human landing system I talked about, it's really a descent stage, it's an ascent stage, and a transfer stage. It's going to get us to the South Pole. Why go to the South Pole? We found there's water at the South Pole as much as we found that there's water below the surface of Mars. The moon, as we've seen with Apollo 13, is really our best proving ground. It takes 6 to 9 months right now to get to Mars. It takes about 3 days to get to the moon. We've not proven we can live on the moon or Mars for an extended period of time. We've got to prove this out. The most vulnerable system in this whole process is the human system. Radiation, as you know, is a big issue. We've just recently sent the Parker Solar Probe towards the sun to learn more about radiation. And that's part of the reason we sent that probe. We also have issues of bone loss, cerebral edemas, muscle loss. These things we're going to have to address before we can start start going to the moon. We're also learning that there are lava tubes on the moon. And in those lava tubes, you have an ambient temperature. And we may find that we may be able to survive better in a lava tube. There's also discussion going on right now whether we can travel underground in these lava tubes. These are things we're just learning right now. The other thing I've recently learned too is at the South Pole is the Aitken Basin. Well, whatever hit the moon to create the Aitken Basin left plenty of iron ore and precious metals. We're also looking at whether we can take AI, 3D printing, robotics, as well as the water we hope to mine there and be able to manufacture materials that we can use to go farther into deep space. This is really about practicing on the moon, using as in situ resources, reducing risk, and improving our capabilities. Janet mentioned Gemini. You know, Gemini and Mercury were really stepping stones for Apollo. Artemis, on and around the moon, this program is really the stepping stone to go to Mars. And that is the third domain. Why Mars? Because who positions themselves to get there first will lead in space in the future. It's up for us to decide. It's up for you in this room to decide that. Last year, Opportunity ended its mission. It was a 90-day mission that lasted 15 years on Mars. Curiosity has proven to us that we've found the building blocks of life on Mars. I'm not saying there's life on Mars, but the building blocks are there. We know that there's water under the surface, as I said. We now have InSight that landed. We're trying to drill through the surface, and I'm not going to deny it. We're having a hard time doing it, but we're still working on it, and we're still hopeful we'll be able to do that. We also have a seismometer on InSight, and in April, we recorded the first Mars quake at a magnitude of 3.0. We're working on Mars 2020, which is the next effort to get to Mars. It's going to have a helicopter, which will triple the distance a rover could travel in a Martian day. And we're also working on Mars sample return, which will be able to provide us with samples that we can bring back to Earth. I expect, you're asking yourselves, how do you fit in as a partner in this effort? This is something much larger than ourselves. And together, we'll forge a new exploration campaign with new science. These challenges are within our abilities. We can go places we've never imagined. So as I stand here before you, I humbly see us leading the world in science and in space. And we join with you to go forward to the moon and then to Mars. Not because NASA and its partners do what no one else can. Not because it's to our advantage as one country over another. We do it because we strive to better the human condition for all people. Not just for the United States, but for the world. So as I stand here, I ask you to accomplish what's needed so that we can build a better life for our children and our grandchildren, possibly finding solutions for Earth's challenges and possibly ensuring the survival of our species. As I said, not just for Americans, but for all people on this earth. Because with U.S. leadership and your leadership, it will happen in a way that benefits all humanity. It's a challenge we've accepted, and it's one we'll win. We are going. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would you be willing to take a few questions? Sure, absolutely. Great. Okay, we're very happy to have you here. Thank you so much. He's willing to take a few questions. So we've got a couple of folks with microphones on the sides of the room. Just raise your hand real nice and high if you have any questions for Mr. Morhard. Anyone at all?
Come on, you guys. I'm ready.
Oh.
Yes, sir.
Here's one up front. We got a microphone coming for you. Hang on one second.
Sir, how long do you expect the first mission to last, and then when will the second mission to the moon be? scheduled?
You know, the first mission, we're still looking at that. The question is, and it's a very good question, because again, why are we going there? We're going there to prepare for Mars. Okay, so it really goes to how long are we going to stay on Mars? And we need to practice that on the moon. I don't have those answers for you exactly how many days, but it's all going to go backwards from what those plans are on Mars. And we're going to work on that on the moon first. And I'm sure you'll see it, a graduation of the missions as they go. But once we start in 24, you'll see a cadence of, one SLS a year for the most part going up there. Again, I can't predict, some of it's logistics, some of but the intent is for humans to continue to go there back and forth.
Thank you, sir.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Mr. Morhard, thank you for being here today. Greatly appreciate it. And also wanted to ask, based on your Senate experience, what do you think the odds are, and maybe the timing for a budget deal to fix the cap so that programs like NASA's vital work aren't arbitrarily cut dramatically in the next fiscal year?
Gotta go. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I like it. I better not say that. This is a tough game, and it's not a game, but it's very challenging. When I was doing appropriations bills, I got the Senate in '83, and we were passing appropriations bills freestanding. At the time, there were 13. Now there are 12. We were also passing authorizations for each agency in the U.S. government. I watched over my career there the degradation of the passage of those bills. When I got to the Appropriations Committee in '91, we were still passing freestanding bills. I was given, I'd been there for a few years, and a guy named Ted Stevens became the chairman, and I told him, I'm working national security defense issues. I didn't want to move anywhere else. I'm happy. And 30 days later, they said, Jim, could you come to the front office? And I was like, oh, geez, I'm either getting fired or promoted. And they said, we want you to take the Commerce Justice State bill. I said, well, that bill hasn't passed in 2 years off the floor. They said, we know. I said, I don't know anything about that bill. They said, neither do I. The staff director said, neither do I. I said, I'll cut everything. And they said, we want you to. I said, I don't want to take this job. He said, you got to take the job. I lost 30 pounds in a month. My Democratic colleague told me that we would hate each other by the end of the year. I tried to quit. The staff director looked at me and said that wasn't an option. He was Sicilian. Good friend to this day. I calmed down. Actually, Ted Stevens took me aside. He had been a flying tiger, and we were at the Senate subway, and he said, I was learning to be a flying tiger, and I didn't believe I'd learn how to fly. And he said, my instructor took me to a graduation of other pilots, and he said, do you see yourself being any different than these guys? And he said, no, sir. And he said, you put your head down, and you'll figure this out. And he looks at me and he goes, Jim, you put your head down, and you're going to figure this out. We passed the bill, and we passed it again and again. But those days are not here right now. And what happens is, this is the Senate and the House, as I know there's a lot of derision towards both, but there's a performing art in passing legislation. And you lose the muscle memory. Just as much as we talk about the cadence of SLS, we have a big concern about losing the muscle memory of launching these rockets. Because if you do it once a year, it's hard to remember what it was you were doing a year ago to make sure you don't make mistakes. It's no different in writing legislation and passing it through subcommittee, full committee, on the Senate floor, in conference between the House and the Senate. That muscle memory has been lost. They're trying to attain it. But in the meantime, we're putting together these packages, which is really getting to your question. And these packages of appropriations bills, the bigger the package, the more difficult it is to pass. And they're being managed somewhere between the Appropriations Committee and the leadership offices. And the leadership offices don't have the depth of knowledge of what's in those bills, but they have the political acumen to pass bills. So here we are, we're looking at caps where you can't spend above these budget caps, and yet there's never enough money to fund what's needed for the federal government. So let me bring it down to the granularity of NASA. We've gone in with a budget request somewhere around 21, 22 billion. We've come in with the president has come in asking for a budget amendment, which, to his credit, is to get us jump-started on what we just talked about. The things we're talking about here aren't going to happen if we don't get that budget amendment. We can't get there in 2024 unless we get the funding to do it. So the House has marked up a bill. They did not put anything in for Artemis. They put in $1.3 billion for science programs, to their credit. We're not against those programs. The Senate has not marked yet. Senator McConnell is not certain whether he's going to allow bills to come to the floor. So if that happens, then you're going to take what the House has done and you're going to have basically draft bills, and there will be some sort of agreement that will come in as a continuing resolution. Now, with a budget amendment, you've still got to get, if that goes into the Senate draft bill, then that will be conferenced with the House and will come somewhere in between with the funding of the agenda of the House and the agenda of the Senate. And the hope is that we will be successful in a continuing resolution. I can't predict, but I'd hazard a guess it will probably be what we call an anomaly. There'll be a separate provision that will have to discuss this and give direction to NASA to do this. I'm still hopeful that, I'm not even hopeful, I'm confident this will happen. The President, this is the President's agenda. He wants it to happen. Senator Shelby, who's the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, is supportive. Senator Moran, the subcommittee chairman, is supportive. You know, to Jim Bridenstine's credit, you know, he was accused of being very partisan in his nomination hearing. The reality is he got to the job and he's been nonpartisan. We cannot do exploration without supporting earth sciences, planetary sciences, heliophysics, but most importantly, earth sciences. And both of us agree they're just as important. We have to do that science also. So it's both. But that keeps NASA nonpartisan, which is what it should be. You know, the intent of the 58 Act that created NASA was to expand our knowledge, to help others. That's why we're here. That's why you're here in this room. That's the beauty of NASA. That's why I'm so fortunate to be standing here. I hope I've answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Okay. All right.
I really appreciate it.
Sure. Okay. Thanks.